the one who breaks the darkness with a liberating light. Praise the one who frees the prisoners, turning blindness into sight.
Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews.
Today we conclude our study in the book of Genesis with chapter 50. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants the physicians to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If I have now found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore please let me go up and bury my father. Then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan, and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite, to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph, saying, Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, Please forgive the transgression of your brothers, and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, Do not fear. For am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you, and will bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. This is the word of the Lord. And the end of the book of Genesis. Now, as we look here, Jacob has just died at the end of chapter 49, and Joseph weeps, and rightly so, right? He's grieving the death of his father. He instructs the physicians to Pharaoh and to himself to embalm his dad. That's a process by which basically they empty out the organs in the body and they fill the chest cavity with things like salt, herbs, spices, in order to prevent it from decaying. As we learn in the text, it's a 40-day process, and they end up mourning a period of 70 days total. So the 40 days plus the 30 extra to make 70. This shows how much Egypt ended up loving Joseph and his family, including his father, because even Pharaoh himself gets 72 days. So Jacob treated very close. Now the time of weeping is past. Joseph speaks to the household of Pharaoh. Notice he doesn't go to Pharaoh himself like he has before. This could be a picture of maybe him still being in mourning. If he's wearing sackcloth for mourning, he could not go before the king. It would make sense. So he speaks, he sends the message that the family would report to Pharaoh what has happened, that he has promised, he's made an oath to his dad. Dad made me swear that he would bury him back in the land of Canaan. So he seeks his permission to go, and then he'll return. Now, in fairness, he's sworn oath. He's going to do it either way. He's seeking the blessing of Pharaoh in doing this thing. Pharaoh permits it, and not only permits it, sends along a great company to accompany him. And so you've got verse 7, the servants of Pharaoh, so those who served him, the elders of Pharaoh's house, and the elders in all the land of Egypt, and then also the family of Joseph and Jacob. This is quite the gathering of people who are going to process from Egypt. They're going to go east of the Promised Land. They're going to go east of the Salt Sea, and they're going to turn north, and they're going to have to cross the Jordan River to enter the Promised Land. Just like the Israelites will have to do when they leave Egypt. At this point, 413 years later. They're in Egypt for 430 years. We're 17 years into that already. They also take soldiers, chariots, and horsemen, essentially to protect this processional, but they leave children and flock behind. There might be a bit of a foreshadowing there to the Exodus again, that Moses will come before Pharaoh and demand that he let the people of God leave Egypt, that they would go to the Promised Land, and there's fighting, and Pharaoh refuses, and over time Pharaoh will permit certain people to go, like only the men can go. Well, only the livestock can go with you, and so forth, until ultimately they all go up. And they all, again, go to the east side and have to cross the Jordan River to get into the Promised Land. So there's some connection here, certainly to the Exodus account, which at this point is only 12 or 13 chapters away. So they indeed go, and you can try to imagine this, what this processional might have looked like, greater than any funeral procession that I think I've ever seen. They reach the threshing floor of Atad. Nowhere else does Atad's name show up in Scripture than this chapter, so this is an idea of one of those historical details in the text that helps give validity to the Scriptures. The people would have known who Atad was. And even as Moses is writing this a few hundred years later, that threshing floor may still bear that name. The name Abel Mizraim that shows up in verse 11, likely still known to that day, to that time. So details that, just like if you were going to read a news report from a year ago, you would recognize if there were details in it that were false. Right? If they said that, I don't know, one of the rappers in our country was the president. We'd be like, well, that's made up. That's not true. So they could do with a text like this, the people at the time. Historical detail. Now, the Canaanites notice the processional, and they're the ones who give the name of the place Abel Mizraim, which is Abel is the word for mourning, Mizraim is the Hebrew word for Egypt, so the mourning of Egypt. Notice they don't attack. Really bad taste to attack a funeral. So they don't, even though that would have been a moment of vulnerability, even with the soldiers accompanying, right? They're still mourning. It's a weak point. They fulfill Joseph's promise, his oath. They bury Jacob where he wanted to be buried, back in the cave of Machpelah. Now, after going home, verse 15, at some point the brothers end up fearing that Joseph is going to continue to hate them. I say continue. That's their mind. We've never got any indication that he did hate them for what they did to him. But the issue here is they seem to think that only Dad was restraining him. that if Dad hadn't been around, Joseph would have treated them differently, which we saw we saw his deception against them. We saw him imprison them. But ultimately, he cared for them even before Dad came to Egypt. So they make up a ruse of their own. Just as he wants to deceive them, now they deceive him, like their father before them. And they pretend that Dad told them all of this, to say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And Joseph weeps. Might be good to ask your kids why Joseph's crying. I guess it could be a number of things. It could be because he knows his brothers are afraid. It could be because he's recognizing their deception. It could be because he feels like his brothers have rejected his forgiveness that he already gave. He's already forgiven them. This is 17 years later. He had plenty of time for revenge. He didn't do it. Although Esau did think in his head many chapters ago that when Isaac died, he could take his vengeance against Jacob. And maybe a last possibility is that he believes what they've said, and he's grieved that his father thought he hadn't forgiven his brothers. It's really hard to say, but there's some things to ponder and possibly talk about. The thing they really want to get into here in this section is, what does it mean to forgive? Okay, so he's got deception aside. He's got a command from Father to forgive his brothers. And then his brothers throw themselves down before him and offer themselves to be his slaves. Would that be forgiveness? Would it be forgiveness for Joseph to say, I forgive you, now you're my slaves? It wouldn't be, and it's important for our kids to see and to recognize that as well. To forgive someone is to lay down our arms. So you have to forgive someone because they have sinned against you. Right? If my wife hasn't sinned against me, there's no need to forgive her for something, or vice versa. So to forgive is to lay down my right to revenge. I've been wronged. I should wrong back. No, forgiveness is I'm not going to wrong back. I'm not going to retaliate. It also lays down the shield. Right? I'm not going to put up a wall in between us. I'm not going to allow this to continue to hinder a relationship between us moving forward. We're reconciled. This is the beauty of what Christ has done for us. Christ had every right, being the holy God of heaven and earth, to strike us down for our sin, to take his vengeance for our rebellion against him, for our attempts to destroy his beautiful creation and to destroy one another whom he has created. But he didn't. He laid down his sword, his right for revenge, and then he laid down his shield. He allowed himself to be harmed for our sake. He was crucified on our behalf. He died that we might live. And this is the beauty of it. God did not put up a shield. There's no wall between God and men. He doesn't say, okay, I forgave you that once, but no more chances. We're finished. We're done here. You go your own way. I'll go mine. That's not forgiveness. And so this is a good spot to teach your children about what forgiveness is and what it isn't. And the brothers have a very muddled picture. Joseph, however, encourages his family, reminds them that he has been providing for them, and he will continue to provide for them. He's been doing it for 17 years. Nothing's changed. And then he reminds them of what he told them a few chapters ago, that even though they sold him into slavery in Egypt as something of hatred, they meant it for evil, God meant it for good. God has been working through all of this in order to save lives, to save people. That's Romans 8 again, the idea that God works all things to the good for his children. Verse 22, the death of Joseph comes. He's 110 years old. That means he lived 80 years in the land of Egypt as a servant in Pharaoh's house. 13 more years, really. So 93 of his years were in Egypt, 80 to Pharaoh. He sees the fourth generation of Ephraim's children. So you've got Ephraim and then his children to the third generation. So Ephraim and 3 is 4. Whereas Manasseh, it's only the third generation. You have Manasseh, Machir, and then Machir's children. So he sees his, on Manasseh's side, that would be his great-grandkids. He sees his great-great-grandkids on Ephraim's side. That's pretty cool. And then he says to his brothers, which could be literal brothers, like Benjamin. Benjamin's no more than 104 at the moment. No more than. Benjamin might still be alive. It's possible one of his older brothers could still be alive. Or it could be that this word brother, which can also be translated kinsman, although brother is the common use. So it could refer to more than just his literal brothers, the other 11. So he tells them he's about to die, and he begins a command to them, much like God often does in the Old Testament. God begins his commands usually with gospel. Think of the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, and even the Jewish synagogue. The first commandment for them is actually verse 1 of that chapter. I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then they go into the other 9, which would be what we think of as 1 through 10. They begin their commandments with gospel, and so does he. God will visit you. God will bring you up out of this land. And then he has them swear that they'll bring his body up with them. Now, this they do. So he dies, he's embalmed, he's put in a coffin. In Exodus 13, verse 19, we see Moses take the bones with them on their journey as they leave Egypt. And then in Joshua chapter 24, verse 32, we finally see Joseph buried in Shechem. Now, the thing worth asking your children here, a couple of things. What promises do we cling to? As we see Joseph clinging to the promise that God had made. But also, did it matter what happens to his bones? The answer to that is no, not in the slightest. If Joseph is buried in Egypt on the last day, God will raise him from the dead. If he's buried in Shechem on the last day, God will raise him from the dead. His promise doesn't change based on your location. So why is this relevant? Why does Joseph do it? He uses his death to remind his brothers, and even generations later, his brothers, his family, of the promise of God and how God is faithful. So he dies. His brothers are told, God will save you. God will bring you up from this land. It's a promise God has made. Trust him. When he does it, take me with you. So when the descendants get to take him with all those years later, they are reminded of the promise, and they're reminded of God's faithfulness that he has done it. And so it is with us. Ultimately, does it matter if you're cremated or buried? No. Doesn't matter if your body's intact or if your body's turned to ash. It doesn't even matter if your body's scattered, although in some places that's illegal. If your ashes are spread over a lake or something. God can and God will restore. He will raise the dead. He's promised to do it. However, how can we be like Joseph? How can we use even our death to point those we care about to Jesus and to the promises Christ has made us? There's not a better option than burial. Burial greatly attests to the belief that this body is being laid to rest in the ground, but on the last day Christ will raise it up again. Scattering ashes does not show that promise. Scattering ashes typically is done over something on this earth that the person loved. And that's no longer fixing your eyes on Jesus. And that's fixing your eyes on your favorite camping spot, your favorite football field. And that's not the hope that we have. So you can be cremated. I'm not making a law for you to follow. But how does your death point your family to Christ? That's what I want you to consider. And you can consider that even as a family, especially if your kids are older, a chance to talk about death and to talk about a funeral. And ask your pastor if he has a funeral planning worksheet, and you can plan your funeral. You can give suggested Bible readings you really want your family to hear that day. Or if you have a favorite hymn from the hymnal, you can put that down. A good funeral planning worksheet, you can even give your pastor some insight into things you want your family to hear about Jesus that day. This is what it's about. It doesn't matter what happens to my bones after I die. But I really do want my kids to know about Jesus. And it's one last chance, at least for me, from my perspective, one last chance for them to get that opportunity to hear it because of me, even after I'm gone. So thanks be to God for the promises that he has made. Thanks be to God that he is faithful to his promises. Today our study of Genesis comes to a close, as Genesis has covered for us roughly 3,000 years of human history, the history of God's creation, nearly half. Nearly half. Thanks be to God.
Let us praise the